And hello, fabulous AP students. This is your favorite teacher, Mr. Jacobson. I am excited to be with you today. We have a great deal to talk about today. It's going to be about America on the world stage. There is so much happening, a lot of interaction happening with the British, the Spanish, Native American Indians. So let us begin. Okay, so Jefferson, his foreign policy. So his foreign policy was trying to stay neutral, kind of like Washington's was, right? However, there were Barbary pirates that were attacking American ships in the Mediterranean in the northern part of Africa. And in the past, Washington and Adams would just pay a tribute just to sort of avoid that from happening. However, when Jefferson became president, they upped the tribute, and Jefferson said, I'm not paying it. And so that led to a conflict in which Jefferson sent some ships, American ships, to go and to protect American interests. And there was a lot of fighting going on for a few years. There was no real decisive win, but it did earn the U.S. a level of respect and offered a measure of protection on the Mediterranean. Also, you have other challenges to the Neutrality Act that America was trying to maintain, especially during the Napoleonic Wars. France and Britain would seize ships from neutral nations and confiscate their cargo. So, Britain was especially known for capturing U.S. sailors, claiming that, hey, you're a British citizen who defected, in essence, and then impressing or forcing them into the British Navy. And this was really upsetting Americans. We also have the Chesapeake Leopard affair. In 1807, only a few miles off the coast of Virginia, the British warship Leopard fired on the U.S. warship Chesapeake, killing 3 Americans and forcing 4 others into the British Navy. So, again, they're impressing people. Many Americans demanded war, but Jefferson resorted to diplomacy and trying to use economic pressures. One of those economic pressures he tried to use was the Embargo Act of 1807. So Congress passed the Embargo Act prohibiting the U.S. merchant ships from sailing to any foreign port. Since the U.S. was Britain's largest trading partner, Jefferson was hoping that the British would just stop violating the rights of the neutral nations rather than lose trade from the U.S. However, the Embargo Act backfired kind of big time on the Americans. The British were fine substituting their trading from America with trading people with nations in South America instead. And this led to an economic depression in New England states, causing New England states to want to succeed from the nation. So, recognizing the failure, Jefferson called for its repeal in 1809 during the final days of his presidency. Madison's going to become the next president. Okay, he's going to try to keep that whole neutrality thing going, but he does need to put some economic pressures on to deal with the Napoleonic Wars. So he's going to institute the Non Intercourse Act of 1809 as a result of the failed Embargo Act of 1807. Madison passed the Non Intercourse Act allowing the U.S. to trade with all nations except Britain. Now, Macon, he's we're gonna have a bill number 2 in 1810, and it's an economic hardship that continued. And the Congressman Nathaniel Macon is going to introduce this bill that's going to restore U.S. trade with Britain and France. So this is what he said. He's like, all right, if either Britain or France formally agrees to respect the U.S. neutrality rights at sea, then the U.S. will prohibit trade with that nation's foe. Now, Britain and France are foes right now, they're at war. So, Napoleon really took advantage of it first. Thus, America started embargoing British trade. However, Napoleon was not an honorable person in this regard. He had no intention of honoring the promise and stopping the practice of the French seizing American merchant ships. And so that didn't go so well, and it made Britain further an enemy or an opposition to America as a result, which is going to eventually lead to the War of 1812. So both the US and Britain didn't want this dispute to end in war, but it did anyway. So what are the causes? Some of the causes are as thus, okay? Although both British and France violated these rights, the British were more severe when confiscating the cargo and these ships because they were now forcing American sailors into the British Navy. This was really upsetting people. This brought up memories of British cruelty during the American Revolution. You have the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans who originally applauded the French for overthrowing their monarchy in the French Revolution. So there was still some better feelings toward the French rather than the British. Okay, so we have more causes that led to the War of 1812. So we have troubles happening also between the British on the western frontier. Okay, we have skirmishes that are occurring. Um, Canada and the border there is being put in dispute between the Americans and the British. You have some altercations between the Americans and a warrior from the Shawnee named Tecumseh, and this is he's going to try to attempt to unite the tribes of the East in Mississippi. Now, this is eventually going to lead to the Battle of Tippecanoe, Tippecanoe, and in 1811, the British are going to provide a little aid to Tecumseh, although the Americans crushed the uprising. But because the British gave a little help to them, it's going to ignite further anger between the British. You also have war hawks happening in Congress. These are war hawks who are Democratic Republicans, but they're eager to fight Britain. So it's led mainly by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John Calhoun of South Carolina. The Warhawk members believed that war was the only way to restore American honor, gain Canada, and destroy American Indian resistance on the frontier. So we have other oppositions happening, right? So the British have sent word that they agreed to the end of the naval blockades and would cooperate with the Americans. So the British send to get, all right, we'll stop blockading you and we'll stop the whole impressment thing. However, by that time, Congress had already declared war by the time that message had got to them. So now there's a declaration of war happening, and Madison is kind of in full throttle here with it. There were a group of Democratic Republicans known as Quids who were old fashioned and they didn't like that the party was in favor of war. Now, a lot of people who didn't like this war viewed it as Mr. Madison's war, um, and of course the Warhawks as well. So you have outspoken people in New England merchants who are saying we don't like this. You have the Federalist politicians who are saying we don't like this, and now you have the Quids who are the old Democratic Republicans saying we don't like this. So there's quite a bit of opposition happening within. Now, the New England merchants were making good money after the Embargo Act of 1807 that Jefferson imposed and then took away right before the end of his presidency. They were starting to make good money after the Embargo Act was over, and they saw that British impressment was sort of a minor thing, so they were not liking the war. The Quids criticized war because it violated classic democratic commitment to limited federal power and trying to maintain peace. And the Federalists saw the war as a way to gain Canada and Florida, thus increasing the Democratic Republican voting strength. Now we got some military things happening here. So Madison's strategy with his cabinet was all right. So we're relying on Napoleon continuing his success in Europe, and two, U.S. land campaign against Canada. So those were his two strategies. So they go to invade Canada, and they do it on 3 points, but they're fairly easily repealed. Although they did get to Toronto or York, which will later be called Toronto, Canada, and they burned a bunch of government buildings. Um, it wasn't super successful. Now, there were some naval battles that were pretty successful happening. The most important one that sort of turned the tides with America was the warship Constitution, known as Old Ironsides, and that's going to defeat and sink a British ship off the coast of Nova Scotia. So also you have American privateers who are motivated by patriotism and profit, and they're going to start capturing many British merchant ships. Offsetting these gains was the success of the British Navy in establishing a blockade. So the British established a blockade of U.S. Ports along the coast, and that's going to really hurt U.S. trading and fishing. Most important battle was on Lake Erie with American Captain Oliver Hazard Perry. This victory led the way to General William Harrison's victory of the Battle of Thames. So, we got more naval battles happening. Um, we have Thomas Macdonald uh, defeated a British ship on Lake Champlain. As a result, we have the British who had to retreat and abandon their plan to invade New York and New England. However, Napoleon was losing, and the British had succeeded over him in Europe. So that allowed the British to go ahead and say, okay, well, we're good here. Let's go commit more troops to the War of 1812 in America. So they send more troops. These troops launch an offensive on the capital, which is Washington, D.C., and they're going to set fire to the White House, the Capitol building, and other government buildings, pretty much as a payback for what the Americans did to Toronto, or York as it was called then. So the British also attempted to take Baltimore, but Fort McHenry held out after a night of bombardment. So if you've heard this before, this is where we get the Star Spangled Banner. It was inspired by Americans holding Fort McHenry, um, and then Francis Key Scott was the one who sort of immortalized that whole moment in the national anthem that is today. So the Southern campaign is going fairly well, though. So you have the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in present-day Alabama, and General Andrew Jackson, he is going to be successful there. He's also going to be successful at the Battle of New Orleans, and he's going to stop the British advancement from trying to control the Mississippi. The battle was fought on January 8th, 1815. However, it was 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed to end the war, but it was still a successful nonetheless. So the ending of the War of 1812. So you have the Treaty of Ghent, and in that treaty, basically, uh, it's in Belgium, and the two parties get together, and they basically decide that this war, they want it to be over. Britain's trying to maintain peace in Europe after defeating Napoleon, and so there's no acknowledgement of guilt on any side. It's pretty much a stalemate, and that's pretty much how it ends. All the boundary lines that were pre-war are now given back to each side. You had the Hartford Convention, and this happened just before the war ended. The New England threatened to secede from the Union. Radical Federalists in New England urged that the Constitution be amended, and that as a last resort, succession be voted upon. A special session was held in December. Delegates from New England state rejected the radical calls for succession, so the delegates didn't feel the same way as the radical Federalists did. However, Congress adopted a number of proposals, which one of them which called for two-thirds vote of both the House and the Senate for a future declaration of war. So they're making it harder to do a declaration of war. Shortly after the convention dissolved, news came from both Jackson's victory of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent. These events ended the criticism of the war and further weakened the Federalists by stamping them as unpatriotic, which is kind of going to put one of those final nails in the Federalist coffin of being a powerful political party. So you have some legacies happening in the war, right? So having survived 2 years of Britain, the U.S. is going to gain respect, more respect. Um, the U.S. Accepted Canada as part of the British Empire. Denounced for its talks of succession, the Federalist Party came to an end as a national force and declined even in New England. Talks of nullification and succession of New England set a precedent that would later be used by the South, leading to the Civil War. Now, abandoned by the British, American Indians were forced to surrender land to the white settlement. With the British naval blockade limiting European goods, U.S. factories were built and Americans moved towards industrial self sufficiency. So, this blockade kind of forced Americans to become more self sufficient and to even start industrializing. War heroes such as Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, they're going to become at the forefront of the new generation of political leaders. And then the feeling of nationalism is going to grow much bigger in the United States. It's going to lay a foundation in the West as people are going to seek to expand more in their own country of America and rely less on Europe. So, Monroe on foreign affairs. Monroe is so okay. So during Madison's presidency, when problems with the Barbary pirates happened, Monroe is Madison's gonna call Stephen Decatur, and he is going to pretty much go there and stop a lot of the issues happening. Um, it's kind of the first time that you have uh, them getting really involved in the Mediterranean. Before it was more like just trying to keep the peace, but now they're the Americans are going to start claiming part of that Mediterranean as something that they can do and hopefully maintain peace in the process. Now, Canada, after the Ghent Treaty, so you have this major disarmament pact that happens. Limited naval armaments in the Great Lakes are going to happen. Eventually, you're going to get the whole border of Canada and and the United States. It's going to be the longest unfortified border in the world where people are just going to accept this borderline and there's going to be mutual respect for it. Now, the Treaty of 1818 will happen, and that's going to improve relations between the U.S. and Britain. They're going to have shared rights on the coast of Newfoundland. They're going to have joint occupations of Oregon Territory for 10 years, set the northern limits of Louisiana Purchase at the 49th parallel, thus establishing the western U.S. Canada boundary line. Now, Florida becomes a big deal here as well, because after the War of 1812, the Americans are going to take the west part of Florida, which is this strip of land, from Alabama and Mississippi all the way to what we call Louisiana. So they're going to take that, and that's going to become an American territory. However, the Spanish aren't going to be able to keep, I guess, the chaos happening in East Florida because you got the Spanish American Revolution happening down in South America. So they have to commit troops to all that. So then that means that there's more chaotic conditions happening with the Seminoles coming over, runaway slaves, white outlaws, and they're conducting raids within like Georgia region, and that's really causing a problem, and that's going to give Monroe and General Andrew Jackson an opportunity to go ahead and put it down and to expand further. So Jackson was commissioned to stop the raiders and even pursue them across the Florida border. He hung two Seminole chiefs, captured the city of Pensacola, and drove out the Spanish governor there. Congress feared Jackson's actions would lead to war with Spain and Britain because they were somewhat allied at this point. But Monroe supported Andrew Jackson, and he continued to further down into Florida. And then eventually you're going to get the Florida Purchase Treaty. And what that means is um, all that. So this treaty turned over the positions of Florida and its claim on the Oregon Territory to the United States. So we have Oregon Territory here, we have Florida down here. In exchange, the United States agreed to assume 5 million in claims against Spain and give up any U.S. territorial claims to the Spanish province of Texas. The agreement is also called the Adams-Onis Treaty. And then you also had the Monroe Doctrine happening. So you got Spain seeking to reassert their dominance in South America. South America. You got Russia, who's encroaching, who's had a presence in Alaska, and even came all the way down to California. And this kind of European and Asian encroachment is concerning to the Americas, especially the United States of America. So you have Monroe here, and he's going to start thinking, all right, what can we do? Well, the British are saying, look, we can band together and we can stop the Spanish from attempting to come back in Latin America, and we'll have this joint Anglo-American, alliance, if you will, and no one's going to mess with us, and we'll just claim the Americas. So Adams um, kind of convinced Monroe that that's not a good idea, and such an alliance would restrict U.S. opportunities from further expansion in the hemisphere because they'd have to always consult with the British, who have that part in Canada, right? So President Monroe decided to act as Adams advised and issue a statement to the world that did not have Britain as the co-author. So the Monroe Doctrine happened on December 2nd, 1823. President Monroe inserted into his annual message to Congress and declared U.S. policy towards Europe and Latin America. So the Monroe Doctrine asserted, as such, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Now, Monroe, he declared further that the United States opposed attempts by the European powers to interfere in the affairs of any republic in the Western Hemisphere. So, what's the impact of this? Well, Monroe's bold words were applauded by the American public, but they were soon forgotten because they were more interested in domestic issues. However, the British were annoyed that they were being excluded from acquiring new land in the Americas, still had the largest empire in the world at the time. So, I mean, this could have gone very badly if Britain wanted to challenge it because they were still very powerful throughout the whole world. But that was kind of Monroe's whole thing. It's like, look, you've like colonized all these other places. Like we're looking at Africa, looking in Asia, Southeast Asia. I mean, you guys are Australia. You guys are everywhere. Okay, so you don't get away from the Americas. We are going to say that there's nobody who gets any piece of the Americas. Europe, keep your hands off the Americas and let these republics be as they are, and so on. So European nations did not challenge Monroe, and this U.S. foreign policy will act as a cornerstone towards the United States treatment of Latin America. Even in 1840, you'll have President James Polk, who was the first of many presidents to justify his foreign policy by referring to Monroe's warning words. And that's pretty much it. Go ahead and write your summary, and we'll talk about this when we return.